For nearly 200 years, armies from Europe crossed thousands of miles to fight for a city most of them had never seen. That city was Jerusalem. Some came for faith, some came for land. Some believed the journey could save their souls. Along the way, kingdoms were created, cities were destroyed, and generations of Christians and Muslims grew up in a world shaped by war. But how did the Crusades actually begin? And why did they last for so long? Let's slow down. Here are the Crusades, in 10 minutes. To understand the Crusades, we need to begin with a map. By the late 11th century, the Mediterranean world was divided between several major powers. In the west were the Christian kingdoms of Europe. To the east stood the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines considered themselves Romans. Their capital, Constantinople, was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the medieval world. For centuries, the empire had controlled much of Anatolia, the great landmass that makes up most of modern Turkey. But that control was beginning to collapse. A new Muslim power, the Seljuk Turks, was expanding westward. In 1071, Byzantine and Seljuk armies met near a place called Manzikert. The Byzantines lost. The battle itself did not destroy the empire, but the political chaos that followed allowed Turkish forces to move deeper into Anatolia. Within a generation, the Byzantines had lost much of the territory that had protected Constantinople from the east. The emperor needed soldiers, so he looked west. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I asked the Pope in Rome for military assistance. He probably expected a limited force of professional warriors. What he received was something much larger. Later that year, Pope Urban II spoke before a gathering at Clermont in France. The exact words of his speech were not recorded at the time. Different versions were written down years later. But the message was clear. Christians in the East needed help. Jerusalem and the holy places of Christianity were under Muslim rule, and the warriors of Europe were being called to march east. Urban also offered a powerful spiritual reward. Those who took part under the proper conditions could receive remission of the temporal penalties associated with confessed sins. For medieval Christians, deeply concerned with salvation and the fate of the soul, this mattered enormously. The idea spread. Knights took vows. Ordinary people joined them. Many sewed simple cloth crosses onto their clothing. This is where the word crusade eventually comes from. They were taking the cross, but there was no single Crusader army, there was no central commander, and there was no detailed master plan. Instead, different groups began moving east. Some were experienced soldiers, others were completely unprepared. The first groups discovered very quickly how dangerous the journey could be. Before the main armies arrived, a loose movement of ordinary people and lesser warriors began marching toward the east. It is often called the People's Crusade. Many lacked supplies, discipline, and military experience. Along the way, some groups attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland, murdering men, women, and children. It was an early sign that the violence of the crusading movement would not remain confined to distant battlefields. After crossing into Anatolia, much of the People's Crusade was destroyed by Seljuk forces. Then the main armies arrived. These were different. They included experienced knights and powerful nobles from France and other parts of Western Europe. They crossed Anatolia. They fought through hunger, disease, and long sieges. At Antioch, the Crusaders spent months outside the walls of the city. Food disappeared, men deserted, horses died. Some chroniclers described conditions of extreme starvation. Eventually, Antioch fell. The Crusaders continued south, and in June 1099, after almost 3 years of travel and war, they finally saw Jerusalem. The city was then controlled by the Fatimid rulers of Egypt. The Crusaders surrounded it. They were exhausted, they were short of water, and they knew that a larger Muslim army might soon arrive from Egypt. After a siege of about 5 weeks, they attacked. On July 15, 1099, Crusader forces entered Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre. Muslims were killed. Jews were killed. The exact number of dead is impossible to know, and medieval accounts often exaggerated numbers. But the scale of the killing was severe. The Crusaders had reached the city they believed God had called them to reclaim, and they took it with extraordinary violence. The Crusaders now faced a simple problem. Taking Jerusalem was one thing. Keeping it was another. Most of the surviving Crusaders eventually returned home. Those who remained controlled a narrow chain of territories along the eastern Mediterranean. These became known as the Crusader States. The most famous was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. European nobles now ruled cities and farmland thousands of miles from the places where they had been born. But the population around them did not suddenly become Western European. Muslims remained. Eastern Christians remained. Jewish communities remained. Languages, religions, and customs overlapped. The result was more complicated than a permanent battlefield. War was common, but so was trade. Crusader rulers sometimes fought Muslim neighbors. At other times, they negotiated with them. Alliances could cross religious lines when politics demanded it. Meanwhile, the Crusaders built castles, large ones, fortresses such as Crac des Chevaliers, controlled roads, and watched the surrounding countryside. Military religious orders also became increasingly important. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller combined religious vows with military service. They protected routes, defended castles, and became some of the most recognizable institutions of the crusading age. For several decades, the Crusader States survived, but there was a basic weakness at the center of their existence. They were small. They depended on support from Europe, and the Muslim territories surrounding them would not remain divided forever. In 1144, the Crusader county of Edessa fell to a Muslim ruler named Zengi. The loss helped trigger the Second Crusade. European kings came east, the campaign failed, and the political situation continued to change. Over the following decades, power in Egypt and Syria gradually began to unite around one man. His name was Salah ad-Din. In the West, he is better known as Saladin. Saladin did not simply appear one day at the gates of Jerusalem. His rise took years. He gained control of Egypt, extended his influence into Syria, and slowly brought important Muslim territories under a more unified command. This changed the balance of power. In 1187, Saladin confronted the main Crusader army near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders marched through intense summer heat. Water became scarce. Saladin's forces harassed them as they moved. Near the horns of Hattin, the Crusader army was surrounded and destroyed. It was a disaster. Much of the military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem disappeared in a single battle. Cities began to surrender. Then Saladin approached Jerusalem. In October 1187, the city surrendered. This time, the mass killing of 1099 was not repeated. Many inhabitants were allowed to leave after paying ransom. Some who could not pay were enslaved, while others were freed through payments and acts of charity. Jerusalem was once again under Muslim rule. Europe was stunned. The loss of Jerusalem triggered another crusade. This time, some of Europe's most powerful rulers became involved. The most famous was Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade became a struggle between two men who would later become legends, Richard and Saladin. But the real campaign was far less romantic than the legends suggest. It was fought through sieges, disease, negotiation, and repeated problems with supplies. The Crusaders captured the coastal city of Acre in 1191. Soon afterward, Richard ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim prisoners after negotiations with Saladin broke down. The war continued. Richard won important battles along the coast, but Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. The problem was not simply capturing the city. Richard understood that even if he took Jerusalem, defending it might be almost impossible. Eventually, the two sides negotiated. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims were allowed access to the holy city. The Crusaders retained territory along parts of the coast. Richard sailed home. He never entered Jerusalem. The Crusades continued, but their direction became increasingly complicated. The clearest example came in 1204. A new crusade had been called. Its supposed destination was the Muslim-controlled world. Instead, the Crusaders ended up attacking Constantinople, a Christian city. Financial debts, Venetian interests, and Byzantine political struggles pulled the expedition away from its original purpose. The Crusaders captured Constantinople. Then they sacked it. Churches were looted, homes were destroyed, religious objects were stolen. The attack deepened the division between Western and Eastern Christianity. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. Other crusading expeditions followed. Some went to Egypt, others were connected to wars in Iberia, the Baltic, and even against Christian opponents in Europe. The word crusade was becoming broader. The Holy Land still mattered. But crusading had become a political and religious tool that could be used in very different conflicts. By the late 13th century, the Crusader States were disappearing. A new power now dominated Egypt and much of the surrounding region, the Mamluks. Their armies captured Crusader fortresses and cities one by one. The Crusaders still held a few coastal strongholds. The most important was Acre. Acre was a port, a military base, a trading center, and by this point, the effective capital of what remained of the Crusader states. In 1291, a large Mamluk army surrounded the city. Siege engines battered the walls. The defenders waited for help. Very little came. After weeks of fighting, the walls were breached. Mamluk forces entered Acre. The city fell. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Others escaped by sea. The remaining Crusader positions along the coast were soon abandoned or captured. After almost 200 years, the age of the Crusader states in the Holy Land was over. So what were the Crusades actually about? Religion? Yes. For many participants, faith was not an excuse added later. They genuinely believed their actions affected the fate of their souls. But the Crusades were also about politics, land, dynastic rivalry, trade, personal ambition, and the struggle for power between kingdoms and empires. The answer changes depending on who we are talking about. A French knight did not necessarily have the same reasons as a Venetian merchant. A Byzantine emperor did not see the Crusaders in the same way as the Pope. And Muslim rulers were not one united group fighting a single Christian enemy. They fought one another too. Sometimes they made agreements with Crusader states. The medieval world was messy. Our maps make it look simple. Large areas painted in different colors: Christian, Muslim, East, West. But the people living inside those colors experienced something far more complicated. The Crusades did not create contact between Europe and the Middle East. Trade and cultural exchange had existed long before them. But the crusading period intensified some connections and transformed others. Merchants moved goods across the Mediterranean: sugar, spices, textiles. Knowledge traveled too, often through networks much larger than the Crusades themselves. The wars also deepened existing divisions. The sack of Constantinople left a lasting wound between Eastern and Western Christians. Jewish communities in Europe suffered massacres connected to early crusading movements, and memories of the wars became part of later Christian and Muslim histories. Even the word crusade survived. Centuries later, it is still used to describe political campaigns, moral causes, and wars, often by people far removed from the medieval world that created it. The Crusades lasted for generations. They involved popes and kings, merchants and pilgrims, knights and farmers, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. There was no single crusade, and there was no single reason behind them all. Perhaps that is the most important thing to understand. History becomes easier when we turn it into a simple story. Two sides, one cause, one war. But the closer we look, the more complicated the picture becomes. And sometimes, understanding history simply means taking the time to look a little closer.